As John quietly followed Emma through the dimly lit streets, he couldn't help but notice how exhausted she seemed. She walked briskly, yet her steps lacked the usual energy that came with her at work. There was a tiredness in her posture, a kind of weight that wasn't just physical but emotional. He wondered how much longer she could keep up this routine of double shifts and long hours without burning out. He felt a strange sense of guilt for not having noticed this sooner. Emma's movements were almost mechanical, as though she had done this same route countless times. She passed by familiar landmarks, an old bookstore, a small cafe, and then a corner where a streetlight flickered in the distance. The houses in this neighborhood were small but well kept, their windows dimly lit with the glow of warm, homely lights. But Emma didn't stop at any of the homes on her path. Instead, she continued walking with determination, as if heading to a place far from the bright lights and comfort of the city. John slowed his pace, careful not to make a sound or alert her to his presence. He knew he had crossed a line by following her like this, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important he needed to understand. Emma was no ordinary employee. Her work ethic was unmatched, but there had to be more to her life than just the office and late-night shifts. He had to know why she was putting herself through so much. Emma eventually stopped in front of a small, modest house at the end of the block. The house was tucked away behind a faded gate, with a small garden that looked like it hadn't been tended to in a while. The paint on the walls was chipped, and the windows were covered with faded curtains, blocking any view from the inside. It looked like a place that had seen better days. Emma stood there for a moment, staring at the door as if gathering the strength to enter. Then she took a deep breath and stepped inside without looking back. John, standing across the street, felt a sense of hesitation wash over him. He had been so certain that following her was the right thing to do. But now, seeing where she lived, he felt a mixture of emotions. He didn't know what he had expected, but this humble home was not what he had imagined for someone like Emma. She was one of the hardest working employees he had ever met. How could someone so capable be living in such conditions? For a moment, John considered turning around and leaving. He felt guilty for prying into her life like this, but something about the situation kept him rooted to the spot. He didn't understand why Emma, who had so much potential, was living in what appeared to be a difficult and modest situation. He couldn't help but feel that there was a story here, one that needed to be heard. John stood in the shadows, watching as Emma disappeared inside the house. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had seen. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: something needed to change. Emma deserved more than this. John, the CEO of a successful tech company, was known for his keen eye for talent. He was always observant of his employees, not just in terms of their work, but also their well-being. One employee who had particularly caught his attention was Emma. She was a dedicated worker, always the first to arrive at the office and the last to leave. It seemed like she was always working overtime, pushing herself harder than anyone else. Her passion and drive were undeniable, but there was something about her that didn't sit quite right with John. One afternoon, while going through the reports, John overheard a conversation between Emma and one of her coworkers in the break room. They were discussing the workload and how much overtime Emma had been putting in. But it wasn't just the long hours that caught his attention. It was something Emma casually said. She mentioned that she hadn't had a proper meal all day and that she was feeling extremely tired. She even laughed it off, saying she might just grab something small to eat at home since she'd be working late again. John felt a pang of concern. He knew how hard Emma worked, but he never imagined it was at the cost of her personal well-being. It wasn't just the long shifts that worried him. It was the fact that she had to ask someone for food. In a company where most employees dined out or had access to meals, why was Emma struggling with something so basic? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He decided to keep an eye on her. That evening, after the workday had ended, John made a decision. Instead of heading straight home like usual, he decided to follow Emma. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to discover, but his curiosity got the better of him. It wasn't just the request for food that troubled him. There had to be more to her story. As he followed her from a distance, John saw Emma walk with a steady pace toward the quieter part of town. The city buzzed around him, but Emma was lost in her thoughts. John kept his distance, careful not to let her notice him. The streets were familiar to him, but they were unfamiliar to Emma, it seemed. The area she walked toward was nothing like the bustling, upscale district where the company's office stood. This was a more residential neighborhood, with smaller houses and fewer lights. It seemed peaceful, but not the type of place one would expect a hard-working, dedicated employee like Emma to call home. Emma didn't seem to mind the distance she was walking. She was focused on getting somewhere, her pace quickening as she moved further into the neighborhood. John's curiosity only grew. Where could she be going? And why was she walking alone? He had to know more. Every step Emma took seemed to take her further from the company's bright, corporate world and into something completely different. Something John wasn't sure he was ready to see, but felt compelled to discover nonetheless. John's thoughts were a whirlwind as he followed her further into the neighborhood. His mind raced with questions. Why was Emma so focused on her work? What was she going through at home that made her willing to push herself so hard at the office, even at the expense of her own health? John didn't have the answers yet, but something told him that by following her, he was about to find out more than he ever expected. John continued to stand in the shadows, feeling both unsettled and curious. He had followed Emma to her home, but now that she was inside, he wasn't sure what to do next. The quiet of the neighborhood felt almost heavy, as though the weight of his thoughts was pressing down on him. The streetlights cast long shadows on the ground, and for a moment, John considered leaving. He could turn around, forget everything he had seen, and just go back to his normal life. But something told him that he couldn't walk away so easily. Emma's situation had been nagging at him since their brief conversation earlier that day. The more he thought about it, the more he felt responsible for not noticing sooner. For the longest time, John had admired Emma's work ethic. She had always been the first to show up to the office, and her productivity was unmatched. But now, seeing where she lived, he began to wonder what else was going on beneath the surface. Was she struggling financially? Had she been putting up a brave front all this time, working herself into exhaustion without anyone noticing? John couldn't help but feel like he had missed the signs. If he had only paid closer attention, he might have been able to help her sooner. The soft creak of a door opening pulled John from his thoughts. He looked up quickly, but it wasn't Emma who had come outside. It was a man, walking slowly toward the gate of the house. He looked older, his face lined with wrinkles, and there was a sense of weariness in his movements. John instinctively stepped back into the shadows, not wanting to be seen, but his curiosity got the better of him. The man paused by the gate for a moment, staring at the ground as though lost in thought. Then, with a sigh, he turned and slowly walked away, disappearing down the street. John didn't know who the man was, but it seemed clear that he was a part of Emma's life in some way. Could he be a relative? Maybe a father or an older brother? The thought lingered in John's mind as he watched the man leave. There was something about the interaction that felt deeply personal, though John couldn't quite put his finger on why. Emma had entered the house alone, but now it seemed like there was someone else, someone who had been part of her life, but wasn't there when she needed them most. The quiet of the night began to feel overwhelming, and John realized he had been standing there for much longer than he intended. He wanted to walk away, to forget what he had seen, but a sense of responsibility kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Emma's situation was more complex than he could understand. The truth was, she wasn't just another employee. She was someone who deserved better, someone who shouldn't have to struggle alone. John took one last look at the house before he turned and made his way back down the street. He didn't know what the next step was, but he knew one thing. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. There was more to Emma's story, and he was determined to find out what it was. The next day, John couldn't stop thinking about Emma and what he had witnessed the previous evening. His mind kept replaying the image of her small, run-down house and the quiet neighborhood she called home. It didn't sit right with him that someone so hardworking, someone who gave so much to the company, was living in such conditions. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the fact that Emma seemed to be carrying a heavy burden, and John couldn't help but feel like he should have noticed sooner. He couldn't let it go. At work, he found himself observing Emma more closely than ever before. She was in her usual spot at the office, typing away at her computer, completely focused on her work. She didn't appear to be any different from the dedicated employee he had always known. But John noticed how pale she looked that morning, how she seemed to move more slowly than usual. Her usual spark of energy was missing, replaced by a quiet exhaustion that John couldn't ignore. It made him wonder if she was still running on fumes after another long shift. During the lunch break, John saw his opportunity. Emma was sitting alone at her desk, eating a small salad she had brought from home. It wasn't much, but it was all she seemed to have. He approached her cautiously, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. He tried to act casual, as though everything was normal, but Emma seemed distracted, as if she wasn't fully present in the moment. "Hey, Emma," John said, trying to break the silence. She looked up, startled for a moment, but quickly composed herself. "Oh, hi, John. Is everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, smiling, though he could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. "I just wanted to check in with you. You've been working really hard lately. How's everything going?" Emma hesitated, her eyes darting briefly to her desk before meeting his gaze. "It's going okay. Just a lot to handle, you know. Double shifts and everything." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. John could see that she was trying to mask something deeper than just work stress. John didn't push her too much. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable or pry into her personal life. But the conversation lingered in his mind long after Emma returned to her work. He knew something was wrong, and he was beginning to understand that it wasn't just about her job. There was a whole other layer to Emma's life that he hadn't seen before, one that she was clearly keeping hidden from everyone, including him. As the day wore on, John found himself preoccupied with thoughts of how to help Emma. He didn't want to make her feel like a charity case, but he knew that she needed something more than just sympathy. He wanted to do something that would make a real difference in her life, something that would help her without making her feel indebted. By the end of the day, John had made up his mind. He knew that if he was going to make a difference in Emma's life, he had to take action. He wasn't sure how or where to begin, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Emma deserved more than she was getting, and he was going to do whatever it took to help her. As he watched her leave the office that evening, John knew he had to find a way to reach out to her, without making her feel uncomfortable or ashamed. The next step, whatever it was, had to be done carefully, with the respect and care she deserved. But he was ready. He couldn't let Emma face her struggles alone any longer. The next day, John couldn't get the thought of Emma out of his mind. He had spent the entire evening trying to come up with a way to help her without overstepping, without making her feel uncomfortable. It was clear to him that she needed assistance, but how could he offer it without making her feel embarrassed or pitied? He knew that Emma had always been fiercely independent, so he didn't want to undermine her sense of pride. But still, the image of her small house, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the way she had smiled weakly while talking about working double shifts all weighed heavily on him. As the day progressed, John continued to look for a moment when he could talk to her privately. It wasn't that he wanted to force a conversation, but he felt that if he didn't act soon, he would lose his chance. He couldn't ignore the feeling that Emma was going through something much deeper than anyone at the office realized. Finally, late in the afternoon, Emma was sitting at her desk, typing away as usual. The office was starting to empty out, and the usual buzz of voices faded into quiet murmurs. John walked over to her desk, careful not to startle her. He didn't want to come across as too eager, but his concern for her made it hard to ignore. "Hey, Emma," he said, trying to sound casual but noticing the way she looked up at him with a slight start, almost as if she hadn't realized he was there. "Got a minute?" Emma smiled politely, though there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes. "Of course, John. What's up?" John took a deep breath, trying to gather his words. He didn't want to seem too direct, but the truth was, he was worried. "I've noticed you've been working a lot lately, and I just wanted to check in. How are you doing? I mean, outside of work." Emma's smile faded a little, and for a moment, there was a long pause. She glanced down at her hands before meeting his gaze. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was something in her eyes, a tiredness, a heaviness, that told John her words didn't match how she was feeling. John leaned against the desk slightly, careful not to push her too hard. "You know, Emma, you don't have to pretend everything's fine if it's not. I've noticed how hard you've been working, and I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself too." She hesitated again, and for a moment, John thought she might brush him off. But instead, she let out a soft sigh, one that seemed to carry more than just physical exhaustion. "It's just, things have been tough lately. Between the long hours and everything at home, it's been a lot to juggle." John's heart tightened. He hadn't expected her to open up so quickly, but it was clear that she needed someone to listen. "You don't have to carry everything on your own, you know," he said gently. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Emma looked down at her desk again, and John could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to say something, but she didn't seem sure how to voice it. Finally, she spoke in a quiet voice, as if the words were hard to form. "It's just, I'm trying to make ends meet. My bills, rent, food. It's all piling up, and I feel like I'm just barely keeping my head above water." John could see how much she was holding back, but it was clear that she had been struggling for a while. He had no idea how deeply her situation ran, but he could sense that it was affecting every part of her life. The weight of responsibility she carried was not just physical, it was mental and emotional too. "I understand," John said softly. "It sounds like a lot to deal with. But listen, if there's anything you ever need, whether it's help with work or just someone to talk to, I'm here. You don't have to go through this by yourself." Emma nodded, but there was still a layer of hesitation in her expression. "Thank you, John. I really appreciate it," she said quietly. But even as she spoke, John could tell that she was still unsure about fully accepting help. John didn't push any further. He could tell that Emma wasn't ready to accept help yet, but the conversation had opened a door. She hadn't completely closed herself off, and that gave him hope. He made a mental note to keep an eye on her, not just at work, but outside of it as well. He knew now that Emma needed more than just support at the office. She needed someone who could be there for her in all the ways that truly mattered. As he walked back to his office, John felt a sense of determination growing inside him. He couldn't change everything all at once, but he could start by showing Emma that she wasn't alone. The days that followed the conversation between John and Emma were quiet, but they weighed heavily on John's mind. He had learned a lot from their brief exchange, but he also realized that words alone wouldn't be enough. Emma was clearly struggling, and while offering her a listening ear had been a start, John knew she needed more. He couldn't just leave her in that position, feeling alone and overwhelmed. John began to think about how he could help without making Emma feel like he was imposing. He didn't want her to feel like a charity case or make her uncomfortable, but he couldn't stand the thought of her continuing to work herself into exhaustion, struggling with her personal life, while giving her all to the company. After a few more days, John decided to take action. But instead of directly offering money or some grand gesture, he chose a different approach, one that would be less invasive but still helpful. He reached out to a trusted friend of his, someone who owned a small home renovation business. This friend, Alex, had helped John in the past with a few projects around his own house. Alex was known for his skills and his genuine desire to help others, so John felt confident that this was the right person to turn to. He made the call to Alex late one evening, after everyone had left the office. The conversation was brief but direct. John explained Emma's situation without going into too many personal details. He mentioned that she was living in a home that seemed to need some repairs and that she had been struggling with her finances. Alex immediately agreed to help, no questions asked. John felt a sense of relief. He didn't have to ask for charity. He was simply arranging for someone to do what they could to improve Emma's living conditions in a way that wouldn't be obvious or uncomfortable for her. A few days later, John had arranged for the renovations to begin. He had made sure that Emma wouldn't know who was behind it, wanting to keep the whole thing a surprise. He knew that if Emma knew he had been the one to arrange it, she might feel embarrassed or indebted. John didn't want that. Instead, he hoped that by transforming her living space, she might feel a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, without feeling like someone was doing something for her out of pity. The work began quietly. Alex and his team worked after hours, ensuring that everything was done without Emma knowing. The renovations were modest but transformative. New paint on the walls, new flooring to replace the old, creaky wooden boards, and a few pieces of new furniture to make the house feel more like a home. They added a comfortable couch and a small dining table, as well as some basic kitchenware so that Emma wouldn't have to rely on scraps or cheap takeout. John felt a strange sense of anticipation as he watched the progress from a distance. He didn't want to rush things, but he was eager to see the transformation. He knew this wasn't the end, but it was a good start. Emma deserved better than the situation she had been living in. And this small gesture, though it didn't fix everything, would hopefully give her a sense of security and comfort that she had been missing for so long. As the days passed, John kept his distance from Emma. He didn't want to raise any suspicions. He continued to observe her at work, though he noticed that she seemed a little more relaxed, even if just slightly. Maybe she was getting some rest. Maybe, just maybe, the changes in her life were starting to make a difference. One evening, a week later, John saw Emma leaving the office again. He noticed that she was walking with a bit more energy in her step, her posture a little less hunched. It was subtle, but it was there. He smiled to himself, feeling like maybe, just maybe, his small effort had made a positive impact. As he watched her walk into the evening, John felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that he had done something that would change Emma's life for the better, without her ever knowing who had helped her. And though he couldn't fix everything, he had taken the first step toward making things easier for her, and that was enough for now. A week passed, and John couldn't help but notice subtle changes in Emma. She seemed a little lighter, her steps less burdened. Though she still worked long hours, there was something about her that seemed different, more present, more at ease. John observed from a distance, never letting her know he was keeping an eye on her. It wasn't that he was trying to control her, but rather, he was quietly relieved to see that she seemed to be carrying less weight on her shoulders, even if just a little. One evening, as John was leaving the office, he noticed Emma walking down the hallway, her usual hurried pace replaced by something more relaxed. She was headed for the door, but her phone rang just as she reached it. John couldn't help but overhear part of her conversation. She was speaking softly, but he could hear the joy in her voice when she mentioned something about her house being fixed up and how everything seemed to be a little better. She thanked the person on the other end of the line and smiled, her eyes lighting up with a hint of happiness John hadn't seen before. It struck him then, whatever had changed in her life, it was beginning to work. The next day, Emma seemed even more at ease. She arrived at the office looking a little more put together than usual. Her hair was neatly done, her outfit pressed, and her posture wasn't as hunched from exhaustion. She greeted her coworkers with a warmer smile, and for the first time in a while, John noticed her laugh a little during a casual conversation. There was still a quiet strength about her, but now, there was also a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe things were starting to improve. As John observed her, he knew he couldn't continue to stay in the background forever. He had done what he could without her knowledge, but it was time for him to address the elephant in the room. Emma deserved to know that someone cared enough to help, and he couldn't keep hiding behind actions that were meant to remain anonymous. It was time to step forward. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One late afternoon, after everyone had finished their tasks for the day, John saw Emma standing by the elevators. She was about to leave, but there was a thoughtful expression on her face. She seemed to be lost in her thoughts when he walked over to her, his heart beating a little faster than usual. "Hey, Emma," John said, trying to sound casual. She looked up at him, her smile still warm, though there was a slight hesitation in her eyes. "Hi, John. What's up?" she asked, still holding her bag by her side. John paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've noticed something different about you lately," he said. "You seem a little more relaxed, like you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Emma's eyes softened. She shifted slightly, her fingers running along the strap of her bag nervously. "I don't know. Things have been better, I guess. It's hard to explain." John took a deep breath. "I know things have been tough for you, Emma. You've been working so hard, and I wanted to help. You didn't deserve to keep struggling on your own." Emma's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quiet. John smiled gently, knowing this moment was inevitable. "I arranged for some repairs at your house. I didn't want you to have to worry about it anymore. You deserve a place where you can rest and feel at ease." Emma stood there for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, slowly, a small smile began to form on her lips. "You did that?" she asked, almost in disbelief. John nodded. "I didn't want you to feel like you were alone, Emma. You've worked so hard, and I just wanted to make things a little easier for you." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "I didn't know anyone could be that kind. I was just trying to get by, you know. But this changes everything." John felt his heart swell with relief. He had been nervous about her reaction, but seeing her like this, genuinely touched, made everything worth it. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "I'm just glad it's helped." Emma nodded, her voice barely audible as she spoke again. As they stood there in the quiet of the office, it felt as though a new chapter was beginning for Emma. The weight she had carried for so long was starting to lift, and John could finally see the potential she had always held within her. She was capable of so much, and now, with a little help, she had the space to show it. Emma left the office that evening with a new sense of hope, and John watched her walk out, feeling proud of what he had done. He knew that the journey wasn't over, but at least now, Emma had a chance to breathe. And that was the first step towards something much better. In the days that followed, Emma's transformation continued. She seemed to walk into the office with a renewed sense of purpose, her steps light, and her smile brighter. John couldn't help but notice how she seemed more energized, more present, and even more confident in the way she interacted with her colleagues. Her workload hadn't lessened, and she was still working the long hours she had before, but something had shifted in her. It was as if the burden she had been carrying for so long had been lifted, even if just a little. One morning, as John walked into the office, he caught sight of Emma at her desk. She was chatting with a coworker, laughing softly at something they'd said. For a moment, John paused and watched her. There was a lightness to her that hadn't been there before, an ease that made her seem less weary and more like the person he had always known her to be. It was clear to him that the changes in her life, though small, were having a profound effect. Emma caught sight of him standing there and offered him a warm smile. "Good morning, John." She greeted him cheerfully, a sparkle in her eyes. John smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "Good morning, Emma. How's everything going?" She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a small, genuine smile. "Better than I expected," she said with a hint of disbelief in her voice. "It's like things are finally starting to fall into place." John felt a sense of relief wash over him. The change in her wasn't just about the physical renovations to her house. It was the fact that she was beginning to believe that she deserved better. She was beginning to take ownership of her own happiness and well-being. And that was something he had wanted to see all along. A few days later, Emma approached John as he was leaving the office. She had something to say, and from the look on her face, it seemed like it was important. John stopped and turned to face her. "Hey, John," she began, her voice slightly nervous but steady. "I wanted to thank you again. I don't think I've ever properly expressed how much what you did for me means. It's not just about the house. It's about the fact that you saw me, really saw me, and cared enough to help." John was taken aback by her words. He hadn't expected her to open up so much. "Emma, you don't have to thank me," he said, his voice soft. "You've worked so hard, and I just wanted to do something that would make your life a little easier." "I know," she said, her smile warm. "But it's more than that. You made me realize that I don't have to go through everything on my own. You showed me that I don't have to carry the weight of the world by myself. I've been so focused on surviving that I forgot to live. I'm starting to realize now that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to accept kindness." John felt his chest tighten with emotion. Hearing her speak so openly, seeing how much she had grown since their first conversation, filled him with pride. He had seen potential in Emma from the beginning, but now he saw the person she had always been beneath the surface, someone strong, capable, and deserving of happiness. "You're not alone, Emma," John said, his voice firm but kind. "And you never have to be." She nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was no need for more words. Emma had begun to recognize her own worth, and that was all that mattered. The weight she had carried for so long was slowly being replaced with a sense of self-worth and confidence. It was a journey that had only just begun, but it was one that she was finally ready to walk on her own terms. As Emma left the office that evening, John watched her go with a sense of fulfillment. He knew he had made a difference in her life, but he also knew that the real work had come from Emma herself. She had taken the steps to change her life, to embrace the help offered, and to believe that she deserved to live with more ease and comfort. And though John's gesture had been just one small part of her journey, it had sparked something in her, a belief that she didn't have to face everything alone. It had given her the chance to rediscover a version of herself that was strong, capable, and deserving of happiness. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt like she had the tools to face it head-on. As John watched her disappear into the evening, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had helped her take the first step toward a better future, and in doing so, he had made a difference, not just in her life,